Good evening. Walk into your kitchen. Open the pantry. Sitting there, tucked between the cinnamon and the cloves, is a small glass jar of brown powder. The smell of holidays, of warmth, of nothing dangerous at all. Now imagine taking a spoon and swallowing 3 tablespoons of that dry, bitter dust. At first, nothing happens. You wait an hour. You wait 3. You start to think it was only a story someone told you. Then the 4th hour arrives, and the moisture disappears from your mouth completely. A weight settles onto your chest, heavy enough that you begin counting your own breaths. Your heart slams against your ribs. The room tilts at the edges, and a feeling of pure, wordless doom pours through you. The opening note of a delirium that will not lift for 2 full days. You have not touched a chemical weapon. You have swallowed the compound Myristicin. For 500 years, the desperate have reached for this exact jar. Sailors with empty flasks, prisoners with nothing left to trade. A 20-year-old named Malcolm Little, serving time in a Boston prison years before the world would know him as Malcolm X. Each of them found the same thing waiting inside, a biological trap, wearing the mask of a flavor. This is the history of nutmeg. Before we continue, if these long, quiet walks through history are helping you rest, it helps this channel more than you'd think to leave a like before you drift off tonight and to subscribe so the next one finds you when you need it. Now, dim the lights a little further if you haven't already. Let us begin. Quietly in the dark, where a story like this belongs. Before this jar ever sat in a kitchen, before eggnog, before pumpkin pie, before a single Christmas cookie, there was a scatter of 6 volcanic islands in the middle of the Banda Sea, so small and so far from anywhere that most mapmakers didn't bother naming them. They didn't need to be big. For most of human history, they were the only place on Earth where a nutmeg tree could grow. 6 islands in total, clustered close enough to sail between in an afternoon. Lontor, the largest. Nera, where a black volcanic cone called Gunung Api rose straight out of the sea, and to this day occasionally reminds everyone nearby that it isn't extinct. And further out, smaller and more exposed, Rosengane, and a barely there sliver of land called Run. The soil beneath all of them was dark with volcanic ash, rich mineral, and it turned out perfect for exactly one thing. Not one tree, not one seed grew wild anywhere else. Not across the vast trading world of China and Arabia. Not on the Indian subcontinent. Not anywhere else a merchant might have thought to look. Myristica fragrans needed this exact volcanic soil, this exact rainfall, this exact patch of ocean, and nowhere else on Earth would produce it for another 200 years. The trees themselves were strange and beautiful things, tall, dark-leaved evergreens that took almost a decade to bear fruit, each one eventually dropping a soft, apricot-colored husk that split open to reveal a hard brown seed wrapped in a lace of brilliant red. That lace would become mace. The seed inside it would become nutmeg. Nobody outside a small ring of traders had ever seen the tree that produced either one. By the time any of it reached a kitchen in Europe, it had already changed hands many times over, carried first by local outrigger canoes to nearby trading islands, then onto larger ships bound for Java or Malacca, then across the Indian Ocean through the Arabian Peninsula, and finally up into the Mediterranean, where merchants in Venice would sell it at the very end of the chain for a price that bore almost no resemblance to what a Bandanese farmer had first been paid for it. Someone in Europe seasoning a dish with it in the year 1400 had no real idea where it had come from, Almost no one would for another century. Long before any European ship found them, the Bandanese people had built a small, prosperous, and unusually independent trading society around that single fact. There was no king here. Village elders, the orang kaya, the rich men, spoke for their communities, selling nutmeg and mace to Chinese, Arab, Indian, and Malay merchants who had been making the long journey for centuries, well before anyone in Europe knew the islands existed at all. Ships arrived with the seasonal winds months apart, and each time the islanders traded dried nutmeg and mace for rice, cloth, porcelain, and whatever else a long voyage had carried. There was no throne to court or bribe, just dozens of independent village councils, each free to deal with whichever ship offered the best terms that year. It was, by the standards of the age, a remarkably open, egalitarian little world, built entirely on top of a seed nobody else could grow. Twice a year, the trees dropped their fruit, and entire villages turned out together to gather it. Splitting the husks, laying the lace-covered seeds out in the sun to dry for weeks at a time, the whole island thick with the smell of it. Children grew up climbing trees their great-grandparents had lightly planted. Nobody on Banda had any particular reason to think this rhythm would ever stop. It had continued, more or less unbroken, for as long as anyone's family could remember. That changed in 1512, when Portuguese ships found their way to the islands and claimed a small foothold, more interested in the wider spice routes than in the islands themselves. It changed far more permanently in 1599, when two Dutch ships under Jacob van Heemskerk anchored offshore. At first, little seemed different. The Dutch paid their fees. They built a trading post. They signed contracts with local orang kaya, the same as every trader before them. Contracts written in Dutch legal language, that the men signing them may never have fully understood, were meant to bind them exclusively, forever, to a single buyer. But the Dutch had not sailed halfway around the world to be one merchant among many. Within a few years, a new company had formed back in Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company, known by its own initials, the VOC, backed by investors who expected returns, and by a government willing to hand it something close to the powers of a state of its own, the right to wage war, sign treaties, and build fortresses under its own flag, an ocean away from anyone who might stop it. It had been formed in 1602 by merging a dozen smaller, competing Dutch trading ventures into a single company. Specifically so, Dutch merchants would stop undercutting one another, and could instead present a united front to everyone else. Within a few decades, it would become, by some measures, the richest private company the world had yet seen. Banda was where that fortune would be built first. The VOC did not want a share of the nutmeg trade. It wanted all of it, permanently, enforced by whatever means that took. The Bandanese, it seems, never fully understood what they had agreed to, or understood it and simply couldn't survive by it. Nutmeg alone did not feed a family. For generations, islanders had traded part of their harvest for rice and other staples with ships from across the region, English vessels included. When they kept doing exactly that, the Dutch felt betrayed. Contracts to the VOC were not a starting point for an ongoing relationship. They were a line, and the line had been crossed. In 1609, Admiral Peter Willems Verhoef arrived with a fleet and a demand for total compliance. Negotiations collapsed. In the confusion that followed, Verhoef and dozens of his men were lured inland, away from their ships, and killed. Among the Dutch officers who survived that ambush, shaken and lucky to be alive at all, was a young company man named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. He carried that morning with him for the next 12 years, the way some people carry a grudge like a second heartbeat. Cohen rose quickly through the company's ranks after that. By 1617, he was Governor-General of the entire VOC in Asia, based in the new stronghold of Batavia, and Banda's stubborn independence had become, to him, something closer to a personal debt than a business problem. There was one more complication standing in his way. On Run, the outermost and smallest of the Banda Islands, barely a mile from end to end, local leaders had signed their own agreement in 1616, accepting the distant King James III of England as their sovereign in exchange for protection from the Dutch. An English East India Company officer named Nathaniel Courthope took up residence to hold the island, backed by a small garrison that grew thinner with every passing year. For 4 years, Courthope refused to leave. The Dutch besieged Run by sea, cutting off food and reinforcements, content simply to wait him out. No dramatic final battle, just the slow grinding math of starvation against stubbornness. His garrison shrank year after year, from disease, from despair, from men who simply slipped away when a Dutch ship offered them safe passage somewhere, anywhere else. Courthope stayed. He held on anyway, through hunger, through disease, through years without a single word from home, until October of 1620, when he was ambushed at sea and killed while returning from a mission to secure allies on a neighboring island. Run's resistance had lost its last voice. Whatever claim England still held to the island, there was no one left to defend it. The idea wasn't even original to him. As early as 1612, a different company official had already proposed a solution with startling clarity, in writing, nearly a decade before anyone acted on it. That the Dutch should force complete submission from the Bandanese, or in his own words, eradicate them entirely and repopulate the islands with people who would follow the rules. It wasn't policy yet, but the thought had already been said out loud, inside the company, long before Cohen ever put it into motion himself. By late October of 1620, Cohen had made up his mind. In a letter to the company's directors in Amsterdam, he wrote plainly that Banda would have to be subjugated once more, and, in his own words, repopulated with other people. It is a chilling kind of sentence to read now. Not a battle cry, not even real anger on the page, just paperwork, the calm, procedural language of a man solving a supply problem. The problem, as Cohen framed it, was that roughly 15,000 people happened to be living somewhere the company wanted entirely for itself. The solution, laid out as plainly as a shipping order, was to remove them, and then put someone else there instead. The directors approved it. At the end of 1620, a fleet sailed from Batavia to carry the plan out. By February of 1621, Cohen himself had arrived at Banda with somewhere between 15 and 19 ships and over 1,600 men, Dutch soldiers, Japanese mercenaries hired specifically for the campaign, and Javanese prisoners pressed into service beside them. It was, by any measure of the era, an overwhelming force to send against a scatter of small trading islands with no standing army of their own. But the Bandanese fought back with everything they had. Lontor, the largest island, was fortified, its defenders armed in part with artillery, once supplied by the English. The first Dutch assault against it failed completely. It would not fail again. On the 8th of May, 1621, Dutch forces captured 44 of the Orang Kaya, The very elders who had negotiated with every trading ship that had anchored off these islands for generations, going back long before a single Dutchman had ever set foot here. Under interrogation methods that historians today describe plainly as torture, several confessed to a sprawling conspiracy against the Dutch, a plot most scholars now agree could not have existed in the form described. It was, more likely, a story invented by frightened men trying to make the pain stop, told to interrogators who had already decided exactly what they wanted to hear. It is one of history's oldest, ugliest patterns. Torture a person long enough, and they will eventually tell you anything. Confirm your own suspicions, and you rarely stop to ask whether they were ever true. All 44 were executed. Their remains were displayed publicly. Not hidden, not disposed of quietly, but left in plain view. A deliberate message to anyone on the islands still considering resistance. There would be no ambiguity about what defiance cost now. Then the rest of the campaign continued. Villages burned. Families fled into the volcanic hills or into the sea, where many drowned or starved rather than surrender to what was coming for them. Some leapt from the cliffs rather than be taken. Others simply vanished from the record, their fate never written down by anyone who cared enough to keep count. Those who couldn't run were killed or captured where they stood. It is impossible now to know the precise number who died in the weeks that followed, only the shape of what was left behind once the smoke cleared. Before 1621, something close to 15,000 people called the Banda Islands home. Afterward, fewer than 1,000 remained. The survivors, those who hadn't fled, hadn't fought, hadn't died, were enslaved, not sent away, not resettled somewhere new and given a life to rebuild, put to work on the very same nutmeg groves that had been their family's free inheritance for generations, now claimed by Dutch planters the company had shipped in specifically to replace them. An entire way of life, a trading culture that had governed itself for centuries without a king, without an army, without ever needing either, had been all but erased in the space of a single season. What remained of Bandanese language, custom, and memory survived only in scattered pockets. In the hill villages, a few families reached, before the soldiers did, among the handful shipped to Batavia as slaves who somehow endured, in fragments passed down by descendants who, generations later, would still insist on calling themselves Bandanese long after almost everyone who could explain why was gone. Cohen had gotten exactly what he asked for in that letter. The islands were emptied, and then, carefully, deliberately, methodically, they were repopulated with other people. With the last organized resistance gone, and the English claim on run, reduced to a handful of colonists, too weak and too few to matter, the Dutch East India Company now held something no government or trading company had ever fully controlled before: the entire world's known supply of nutmeg, at its single point of origin, with no rival left standing close enough to contest it. Cohen did not entirely escape consequence, even in his own lifetime, though nothing remotely proportional to what he'd done. In 1623, Dutch officials on the nearby island of Ambon arrested a group of English merchants, accused them of plotting to seize a Dutch fort, tortured confessions out of them, using methods disturbingly similar to what had been used on the Orang Kaya 2 years earlier, and executed most of them. The incident became an international scandal, the Amboina massacre, as it came to be known in England. And while Cohen hadn't been directly involved, He was the company's senior official in the region and was held morally responsible. He was temporarily barred from returning to Batavia and made to defend his conduct back in Amsterdam. He eventually returned to his post in 1627 and died there of dysentery 2 years later, in 1629, never publicly held to account for Banda, but briefly, awkwardly answerable for a smaller echo of the exact same method used this time against people whose deaths mattered more, politically, to more powerful men back in Europe. For more than 2.5 centuries after his death, the Netherlands remembered him, when it remembered him at all, as a national hero, the ruthless but effective founder of a colonial empire that made the country extraordinarily wealthy. In 1893, his hometown of Hoorn erected a bronze statue of him in the town's central square, part of a wave of monuments built across the country to celebrate figures held up as models of Dutch ambition and enterprise. The statue has never stopped being argued over. Within Hoorn itself, Cohen eventually picked up a second unofficial title, the Slaughterer of Banda, and the monument has been smeared with paint and graffiti more times than anyone has bothered to count. In 2011, a citizen's petition called for its removal. The statue was restored to its pedestal regardless, though the town added an updated inscription acknowledging the controversy, and the local museum eventually staged an exhibition inviting visitors to render their own verdict on whether Cohen deserved the honor at all. The debate resurfaced with new force during the global protests of 2020. As of this recording, the statue still stands in Hoorn's town square, a bronze monument to a man 4 centuries dead, still actively being argued about in the country whose fortune he helped build. It is a strange kind of afterlife for a colonial administrator, not forgotten, not quietly honored, but permanently, actively contested, generation after generation, by people who never knew him and never will. The Bandanese, meanwhile, have no statue anywhere. What survives of them survives in family names, in a handful of surviving customs, in a museum on Bandanera itself that now tells the story from the other direction. And in documentaries like this one, 4 centuries later, still trying to get the order of events right. It had cost thousands of lives to secure a monopoly on a spice, something you could hold an entire year's harvest of in 2 cupped hands. Not gold, not silk, not a rare stone pulled from a single mine. A dried seed, roughly the size of a large olive, grown on a tree that any farmer with the right soil could have planted, if the right soil had existed anywhere else on the planet. To understand why anyone believed that trade was worth it, worth burning villages for, worth a 12-year grudge, worth emptying an entire archipelago and quietly refilling it with someone else's labor. You have to understand exactly what this small, unremarkable-looking seed was worth once it left these islands behind and reached the markets of Europe. Because nutmeg wasn't just valuable there. It was gram for gram, worth more than gold. That comparison, gram for gram, worth more than gold, is not an exaggeration built for a documentary. It is, if anything, an understatement of just how far people were willing to go for this single, unremarkable-looking seed. And nowhere is that clearer than in what happened to the tiny island of Run itself, decades after Cohen's fleet had already emptied it of nearly everyone who'd ever called it home. Even after 1621, the Dutch didn't fully, legally own Run. England's claim, signed back in 1616, the one Courthope had died defending, never entirely went away. It surfaced again and again over the following decades, a diplomatic splinter neither side could quite remove, flaring up whenever the two countries went to war over trade elsewhere in the world. After the first of several Anglo-Dutch wars ended in 1654, a treaty even specified that Run should be formally returned to England, a promise the Dutch were in no particular hurry to keep, since they were the ones actually sitting on the island with soldiers and nutmeg trees and no incentive whatsoever to leave. It would take another war, another treaty, and an entirely different ocean to finally settle the matter for good. While diplomats argued over the fine print, back on Banda itself, the arrangement Cohen had engineered kept grinding forward exactly as designed. Dutch planters, Perkiniers as the company called them, ran the nutmeg groves using the labor of the enslaved Bandanese survivors, alongside slaves shipped in from elsewhere to replace those who hadn't survived at all. The harvests kept coming. The profits kept flowing back to Amsterdam. Whatever flag technically flew over Run in any given decade, the actual nutmeg economy Cohen had built in blood back in 1621 didn't pause for a single one of these treaties. On the other side of the globe, the Dutch held a marshy little settlement on the North American coast called New Amsterdam. It wasn't much to look at. A cluster of a few thousand people, a fur-trading outpost, more than a true city, farmland and windmills, and a defensive wall along its northern edge, built against threats that, as it turned out, never quite materialized from that direction. Nobody involved considered it anything close to Run's equal in value. In 1664, English ships sailed into its harbor and took the whole settlement without much of a fight, renaming it New York after the Duke who'd claimed it. 3 years later, on the 31st of July, 1667, England and the Dutch Republic signed the Treaty of Breda to formally end the war between them. Buried inside its terms was a trade. England would keep New Amsterdam. The Dutch would keep undisputed, permanent legal claim to Run. At the time, it seemed like the better half of that deal went to the Dutch. Run, tiny as it was, produced nutmeg. New Amsterdam produced almost nothing anyone particularly wanted. Neither side had any way of knowing in 1667 which piece of land they had actually just traded away. The Dutch went home, certain they'd won. 3.5 centuries later, that swampy fur-trading post is called Manhattan. There's no real need to feel sorry for the Dutch over it. In the middle of the 17th century, judged strictly by the economics of the moment, they had made the obviously correct trade. Nutmeg was scarce, guaranteed, and immensely profitable. Fur-trading swampland was none of those things. It would take 3.5 centuries of history nobody involved could have possibly predicted: skyscrapers, stock exchanges, a bridge, an island's worth of ambition, to turn that decision into the punchline it's since become. To understand why the Dutch made that trade so willingly, why they'd spend a war's worth of leverage on a strip of land you could walk across in 20 minutes, you have to go back further still, to a trading floor in Venice, some 700 years before Cohen ever set foot on Banda. By the 10th century, merchants there were already weighing nutmeg against gold, coin for coin, and finding the spice came out ahead. A single pound of it, by some accounts, could be worth more than a pound of gold itself. An object so small, you could carry a fortune in your coat pocket and never feel the weight of it. Remember the journey this seed had to make. Outrigger canoe to Java, larger ship to the Arabian Peninsula, caravan across the desert. Finally, a Venetian galley into the heart of Europe. Every hand it passed through took its share, and by the time it reached a merchant scale in a Mediterranean port, the price had climbed to something almost absurd. One respected historian of the spice trade has put the total markup, door to door, at somewhere near 32,000%. A seed that cost a Bandanese farmer almost nothing to grow could, by the end of that journey, fund a comfortable life for whichever merchant happened to be holding it when it finally arrived. Other spices commanded high prices too: pepper, cinnamon, cloves. But none of them were quite so absolute a monopoly. Pepper grew across a wide swath of the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Competition, however imperfect, kept some kind of ceiling on its price. Nutmeg had no such ceiling. For as long as the Banda Islands remained the only source on the planet, whoever controlled those 6 small islands controlled the entire global supply of one of the most sought-after substances in the world, with no competitor anywhere capable of undercutting them. That is the specific, absolute kind of power an empire will burn a civilization down trying to secure. Nutmeg was not the only spice the VOC fought this hard to control. A few hundred miles north of Banda, the volcanic islands of Ambon, Ternate, and Tidore held the world's entire supply of another spice just as coveted: cloves. The company applied almost exactly the same playbook there that it had perfected on Banda: enforced quotas, destroyed competing plantations, and, when resistance proved too stubborn, resorted to methods a modern reader would recognize immediately. It even had a name for the patrols used to enforce this: hongi expeditions, armed fleets of war canoes that moved from village to village, uprooting any clove tree planted outside company-sanctioned plantations and punishing anyone caught selling to an unauthorized buyer. A permanent, roving enforcement of scarcity, manufacturing on cloves the exact monopoly conditions geography alone had handed them on nutmeg. In the 1650s, facing sustained resistance in a region called Hoamoal, VOC forces destroyed the local clove groves, deported the survivors, and scattered what remained of the population across other islands, specifically to break their ability to organize as a community. One VOC official at the time described the goal with the same bureaucratic bluntness Cohen had used decades earlier as ensuring the people would lose their own name all the more. Historians studying the period have not hesitated to use the word genocide for what happened there too. Banda, in other words, wasn't an aberration in an otherwise ordinary colonial enterprise. It was the prototype, the method the company went on to apply with only minor variations. Wherever else in the archipelago, a monopoly seemed worth the cost in human lives. For more than a century, this two-pronged monopoly, nutmeg from Banda, cloves from the Moluccas further north, made the VOC one of the wealthiest commercial enterprises the world had ever produced. It could not in the end last forever. In 1770, a French naturalist and colonial administrator managed to smuggle clove seedlings out of Dutch-controlled territory, breaking a monopoly that had stood for more than a century and a half. Nutmeg's monopoly held a few decades longer, until the Napoleonic Wars gave the British a brief opportunity to occupy the Banda Islands themselves. In the process, they uprooted nutmeg seedlings and transplanted them to British colonies elsewhere, most successfully on the Caribbean island of Grenada. Half a world away from the volcanic soil nutmeg had once needed so specifically. Grenada's climate, it turned out, suited the tree almost as well as Banda's ever had. The island grows nutmeg to this day, in large enough quantities that Grenadians sometimes call their home the Isle of Spice, and the seed appears split open, mace curling around it, directly on the national flag. A small green emblem of an origin story that begins, whether modern Grenadians think about it often or not, with a massacre on the other side of the planet. By the end of the 18th century, the VOC itself was in serious financial trouble, mismanaged, corrupt in its upper ranks, and weighed down by the sheer cost of maintaining fortresses and garrisons across an entire ocean's worth of islands. In 1799, the company that Cohen had helped build into the world's richest private enterprise was formally dissolved, its debts and remaining possessions absorbed by the Dutch government itself. The monopoly it had killed so many people to secure had by then already begun slipping away regardless, cut down, smuggled out, and replanted, seed by seed, on the other side of the world. It's worth remembering that the entire European age of exploration, the caravels, the circumnavigations, the colonies planted on every habitable coastline within reach, was driven in no small part by exactly this kind of arithmetic. Find the source, control the source. Nobody in Lisbon or Amsterdam or London needed a more complicated business plan than that. Nutmeg and cloves were never fought over by the Dutch alone either. Portuguese traders had controlled parts of the region for nearly a century before the Dutch ever arrived, and Spanish forces held a foothold on Tidore into the 1660s. England remained the most persistent rival throughout, contesting Dutch control of Ambon and the Bandas for decades, even after losing the direct fight for Run. What set the Dutch apart wasn't some restraint the others lacked. Portuguese and Spanish colonial rule in the region carried its own long record of violence, but sheer persistence, financial backing, and a willingness to commit military resources that other European powers stretched thin across the globe simply couldn't match. That value shaped how nutmeg was handled once it reached European hands. Whole seeds, not ground powder, were what the truly wealthy purchased and guarded. Pre-ground spice was too easy for an unscrupulous merchant to stretch with sawdust or cheaper fillers, and far too valuable to trust to anyone else's honesty. Well-off households kept their own small silver graters, sometimes built directly into a locket worn on a chain, so a nutmeg could be grated fresh in plain view whenever it was needed. Owning one meant, quite literally, carrying a piece of your fortune around your neck. But flavor and rarity alone don't explain a markup like that. What truly drove the price of nutmeg into the stratosphere was a belief that had nothing to do with cooking at all. The conviction, held for the better part of 1,000 years across multiple continents, that this small brown seed could heal almost anything wrong with the human body. The belief predates Europe's involvement entirely. Around the year 1000, the Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, one of the most influential doctors in history, was already writing about Banda's nutmeg and its properties. From there, the knowledge spread the way most things did in that era, slowly along trade routes, passed from physician to physician and language to language. Arab merchants had been carrying nutmeg into the Mediterranean world since at least the 6th century, and by the time it reached Constantinople, It arrived already wrapped in centuries of accumulated medical reputation from cultures who had been prescribing it long before a single European physician had ever encountered the seed. By the 12th century, as that same trade carried it onward into Western Europe, its reputation traveled with it. The German abbess and healer Hildegard of Bingen included it in her own remedies, most memorably in a recipe she called, in translation, cookies of joy. Nutmeg baked together with cinnamon and other spices, meant to lighten a troubled mind and correct what she described as an imbalance of the humours. Geoffrey Chaucer mentioned it in the Canterbury Tales, a small sign of just how thoroughly the spice had worked its way into the culture of the age. Physicians of the period credited nutmeg with treating stomach complaints, headaches, bad breath, fevers and rheumatism, and, with rather less scientific justification, tumors, melancholy, and a failing memory. By the height of the era, there was barely an ailment in the medical vocabulary that someone, somewhere, hadn't already tried treating with it. Even setting medicine aside, nutmeg had become something close to a marker of status by this point, sprinkled over banqueting dishes to signal a host's wealth, folded into spiced wines and festive breads, served at winter feasts and holy days. That association is, oddly, one of the only threads connecting medieval Europe directly to your own kitchen tonight. The instinct to reach for nutmeg, specifically around the darkest, coldest part of the year. The eggnog, the pumpkin pie, the mulled wine, traces back, in a fairly direct line, to wealthy households 7 or 8 centuries ago, doing more or less the same thing, for reasons that had far less to do with taste than with what a guest would think, watching it get sprinkled onto their plate. But its single greatest reputation, the one that would drive its price to true absurdity, arrived with the Black Death. It's difficult now to fully picture how completely that plague reshaped Europe's relationship with fear itself. Across the 14th century alone, outbreaks are estimated to have killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of the continent. Whole villages emptied within weeks, city streets so thick with the dead that mass graves couldn't be dug fast enough to keep up. In that kind of crisis, people will try almost anything that offers even the faintest promise of protection. Nutmeg, expensive, exotic, and already wrapped in centuries of medical mystique, was an obvious candidate. Medieval physicians didn't understand germs. Nobody would for another 500 years. What they understood, or believed they understood, was smell. Under what's now called miasma theory, disease was thought to travel through the air itself, carried on foul odors rising from waste, sickness, and decay. The stench of a battlefield, a sick room, an overcrowded slum in high summer. If bad smells spread disease, the reasoning went, then strong, pleasant smells might hold it back, might purify the very air a person breathed. Nutmeg, with its sharp, warm, unmistakable fragrance, became one of the era's most trusted defenses. Picture the image most people now associate with the plague itself. A physician in a long black coat and wide-brimmed hat, an eerie beaked mask with round glass eyes, walking through streets littered with the dead and dying. That beak wasn't decoration or theater. It was a filter, packed dense with dried herbs and spices, nutmeg chief among them, worn in the genuine belief that breathing air scented strongly enough would keep the sickness at bay. Wealthier citizens who couldn't justify the full mask carried pomanders instead, small perforated balls packed with nutmeg and similar aromatics, worn on a cord around the neck or clipped to a belt, pressed close to the nose whenever the streets grew too foul to bear. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI is even said to have ordered the streets of Rome dusted with nutmeg before his own coronation in the 12th century. Not decoration, but protection, as far as anyone at the time understood the word. Here is where the story turns, quietly, into something stranger than anyone alive then could have known. The physicians were wrong about almost everything. Disease did not travel on bad smells. The masks, the pomanders, the dusted streets, none of it did what anyone believed it was doing. And yet, nutmeg does, in fact, carry mild natural insecticidal properties. Modern researchers have confirmed as much, centuries after the fact. It's entirely possible, not proven but plausible, and noted by more than one historian of the period, that all that nutmeg stuffed into beaked masks and pomanders offered some small accidental protection after all. Not against bad air. There was never anything wrong with the air itself. Against fleas, the actual carriers of the actual disease, riding on the actual rats that infested medieval cities by the thousands, moving from person to person in exactly the close, crowded conditions where a strong-smelling mask or pomander might, just possibly, have kept one more flea from landing where it shouldn't. The cure and the cause may have brushed right past each other for centuries, unrecognized, unremarked upon, understood by no one, not the physicians burning nutmeg in their masks for entirely the wrong reason, and not the disease finding its real way in regardless. Right answer, wrong reason. It is a strange kind of comfort and a strange kind of warning, both at once. People can be protected, a little, by pure accident, while believing completely the wrong story about their own safety. They can go on trusting that story for generations, right up until something forces them to ask a harder question than the one they thought they'd already answered. It would take 300 more years and an entirely different branch of science before anyone asked that harder question about nutmeg itself. And the true reasons, once found, would turn out to be far stranger and considerably more dangerous than a theory about bad-smelling air. For centuries, that was simply how it worked. A seed nobody understood, prescribed for ailments nobody could properly diagnose, defended by theories nobody could prove, worth more than gold to people who couldn't have told you, if pressed, exactly why it worked. Only that, often enough, it seemed to. Someone, eventually, would ask why anyway. Not a physician in a beaked mask, and not a merchant weighing it against coin. Someone with tools nobody in Chaucer's Europe could have imagined, and the answer waiting for them had nothing to do with plague or flavor or fortune. It was hiding in the seed itself all along, in a compound no one yet had a name for, doing something no one yet understood, to a part of the body no one yet knew to suspect. It had been there the entire time, through Ibn Sina's writings, through Hildegard's cookies of joy, through every beaked mask, every silver locket, every coronation street dusted brown for a king who thought he was protecting himself. Waiting. It had been waiting inside a compound called Myristicin. Not hiding exactly. Nothing about a seed is capable of intent. Just waiting the way any chemical waits for the right conditions to do what it was always going to do. Return now to that kitchen, to the jar tucked between the cinnamon and the cloves, to the 3 tablespoons swallowed dry off a spoon, to the hour that passed afterward with nothing to show for it. No taste lingering, no warning, nothing but an ordinary kitchen exactly as it had been an hour before. And the second hour just as uneventful. And the third which is usually when the doubt creeps in, when a person starts to wonder whether anything was ever going to happen at all. Nothing coincidental was happening in that silence. Something was already underway inside the body. It simply hadn't announced itself yet. Nutmeg's active compounds don't act quickly. Once swallowed, they have to survive the stomach, cross into the small intestine, and be absorbed into the bloodstream before the body can do anything with them at all. And even then, the real transformation hasn't happened yet. The compound has to reach the liver first. Only there, broken down and rebuilt by the same organ that processes everything else a person eats or drinks, does Myristicin become something the brain will actually notice. For most people, that whole process takes somewhere between 3 and 8 hours, which is exactly why the 4th hour in that kitchen arrives the way it does. Not gradually, not as a mounting unease you might have caught early and stopped, but almost all at once. The mouth goes dry completely, as if every trace of moisture has been called elsewhere. The heart rate climbs, sometimes sharply. Blood vessels near the surface of the skin dilate, producing a flush across the face and chest. And underneath all of it, for reasons doctors still don't fully agree on, comes that specific, wordless sense of dread. A feeling entirely disproportionate to anything actually happening in the room. Beyond the physical symptoms, the psychological ones are what people tend to describe afterward in the most detail, and the descriptions vary enormously from one account to the next. Some report vivid visual distortion, walls that seem to breathe, colors that shift and deepen, a sense of time stretching or compressing unpredictably. Others describe something closer to a waking dream, disconnected from the room around them entirely, unable afterward to say how much of what they remember actually happened. A smaller number report nothing pleasant at all, just the racing heart, the dread, and hour after hour of wishing it would stop. There is no reliable way to predict beforehand which version any given person will get. That delay is, in its own way, the cruelest part of the entire mechanism. A fast-acting poison announces itself. Cause and effect stay close enough together that a person or a physician standing over them can draw a straight line between the two. Nutmeg doesn't allow that line to be drawn so easily. 3 hours, sometimes longer, is more than enough time to finish a meal, wash the dishes, forget entirely what you ate, and start feeling something with no obvious connection back to a spice jar in the pantry. For centuries, that gap in time was wide enough to hide the entire cause. A physician examining a patient in the 4th or 5th hour after exposure had no reliable way of tracing the dread, the racing heart, the encroaching hallucinations, back to a decision made that same morning at breakfast. It's worth wondering how many entries in old parish records, old ship's logs, old asylum admission books, sudden delirium, fits of terror, possession by some unnamed humor, might, in a handful of unrecorded cases, have simply been someone's 4th hour arriving. There is no way to go back and test for it now, but the timeline fits an uncomfortable number of old stories that otherwise made no medical sense to the people writing them down at the time. The compound responsible carries the same name as the spice's most famous byproduct, Myristicin, concentrated in nutmeg's essential oil, alongside a related compound called elemicin. Both belong to a family of naturally occurring chemicals called alkylbenzenes, the same broad family that gives dill, parsley, and a handful of other kitchen herbs their own faint, usually harmless trace of similar molecules. You have almost certainly eaten alkynyl benzenes 100 times without incident, in quantities small enough that your liver processed them without any fanfare at all. Nutmeg is simply where the concentration crosses a line most kitchen herbs never approach, high enough in a large enough quantity for those molecules to do something considerably more than season a dish. Once myristicin reaches the liver, the body converts it into a compound called MMDA, shorthand for a molecule structurally related to amphetamine, similar in shape and behavior to synthetic hallucinogens. Chemists wouldn't synthesize in a laboratory for centuries yet. Elemicin, meanwhile, bears its own resemblance to mescaline, the active compound in peyote. Neither transformation was ever intended by the tree that produced these compounds. Nutmeg's chemistry evolved, almost certainly, to discourage insects and other pests from eating its seeds, not to interact with the human liver at all. But the human liver processes it anyway, entirely blind to the fact that it was never actually the intended target. The compounds themselves weren't formally isolated and named until the 19th century, as the young science of organic chemistry began methodically breaking essential oils down into their component parts. Even then, isolating a molecule and understanding what it actually does inside a human body are two very different achievements, separated by decades more of research. It wasn't until well into the 20th century, long after Chaucer, long after the plague doctors, long after Cohen's fleet had already secured its monopoly, that anyone traced the specific chain of events from a swallowed seed to a psychoactive metabolite circulating through someone's bloodstream. What results is a genuinely strange, almost contradictory clinical picture, one that has puzzled physicians for as long as they've been documenting it. Some of nutmeg's effects belong to a category called anticholinergic. The dry mouth, the dilated pupils, the flushed skin, symptoms that typically show up with plant poisons like belladonna. Others belong to an almost opposite category, sympathomimetic, the racing heart, the agitation, the hallucinations, symptoms that usually accompany stimulants and amphetamines. Ordinarily, a poisoning presents as one or the other. Nutmeg does both at once, fighting itself inside the same nervous system, and the medical literature on the subject still hasn't fully settled on why. A physician trained to recognize one pattern will understandably sometimes misjudge a case shaped like both at once, and in a situation already this unpredictable. That kind of mistake rarely helps. It remains, even now, one of the stranger entries in modern toxicology. An intoxication doctors can recognize by pattern long before they can fully explain by mechanism. Even with the mechanism reasonably well understood today, nutmeg poisoning can still catch a hospital off guard. It doesn't announce itself like a textbook case of anything in particular. A patient arrives agitated, heart racing, pupils oddly dilated, insisting nothing unusual happened in the hours before, because as far as they can remember, nothing did. Standard toxicology screens, built to catch the substances doctors expect to see, often turn up nothing at all, since nutmeg isn't what most emergency rooms are trained to look for first. More than one case report describes the actual diagnosis arriving only after a nurse or physician happened to ask, almost as an afterthought, what the patient had eaten that morning. Before that question gets asked, it isn't unusual for a case to be misread entirely, mistaken for a reaction to some other substance, or a psychiatric episode with no clear trigger at all, simply because nobody in the room had any reason yet to suspect the spice rack. However it works, the timeline stays fairly consistent. Effects typically last anywhere from 24 hours to, in more severe cases, closer to 3 full days. The delirium the Hook described, the one that doesn't lift for 2 full days, sits squarely inside that documented range. As for how much it takes, recorded cases put the minimum threshold for any psychoactive effect at around 5 grams of ground nutmeg, with the more reliably intense range beginning around 15 to 30 grams, which is, not coincidentally, almost exactly 2 to 3 tablespoons. That specific amount, the exact quantity in that kitchen jar, turns up again and again across a century of case reports, from all sorts of different people, in all sorts of different circumstances. It is apparently the amount a person reaches for when they've decided to find out. Part of what makes any of this so unpredictable is that nutmeg itself isn't consistent. Myristicin content varies from seed to seed, depending on where it was grown, how it was stored, how finely it was ground, and how fresh it still was by the time it reached a spoon. 2 people consuming what looks like an identical amount can end up with meaningfully different experiences, which helps explain why case reports describe such a wide range of outcomes from doses that, on paper, look nearly the same. Poison control centers now track nutmeg exposures as their own distinct category, separate from other plant-based intoxicants, simply because the pattern has become common enough and strange enough to need its own classification. The calls tend to follow a familiar shape: someone who consumed far more than any recipe would ever call for several hours ago, now presenting with symptoms nobody in the household can quite explain. The earliest documented case dates back to 1576, recorded by a physician named Lobel. A pregnant Englishwoman, hoping to bring on a delayed menstrual cycle, consumed somewhere between 10 and 12 whole nutmegs, several times the threshold for serious effects, and became, by his account, thoroughly and dangerously inebriated. Little else is known about her beyond what Lobel recorded. In an era with few reliable options for managing reproductive health, and fewer still that a woman could act on without a physician's involvement, herbal and dietary remedies for a delayed cycle were common enough, most of them harmless, some of them not. Nutmeg, already famous for its supposed medicinal power, was simply one more option within reach. What she got instead, according to the record, was a night of profound and frightening intoxication, with no clear idea at the time why. It stands as the first written record of what would become, across the next 4.5 centuries, one of history's most persistent and least suspected forms of accidental self-poisoning. Deaths from nutmeg alone remain genuinely rare. The human body can absorb a surprising amount of punishment from this particular compound and recover, given time and supportive care. But fatal cases are not unheard of. Medical literature includes at least one well-documented account of a child who consumed roughly 2 whole nutmegs and slipped into a coma. Treatment, when someone does seek it, is almost entirely supportive: fluids, monitoring, time, and a hospital bed to safely wait it out in, rather than any specific antidote, since none exists. Most people who receive that basic level of care recover completely, if miserably. It is precisely the kind of outcome that makes nutmeg poisoning so difficult to categorize. Ordinary enough to seem harmless, unpredictable enough to occasionally turn severe, ambiguous enough that trained physicians, generations apart, have struggled to agree on exactly how dangerous it really is. children remain, even now, disproportionately represented among accidental cases. Small bodies process the same dose very differently than adult ones do, and a spice jar left within easy reach of a curious toddler has occasionally proven more dangerous than anyone baking with it that day could have anticipated. Most such cases end in recovery. Not all of them do. For a surprisingly long stretch of American history, nutmeg's medicinal reputation carried actual legal standing. Myristica, nutmeg's formal botanical name, remained an officially recognized medicine in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the government-sanctioned reference listing, which substances counted as legitimate drugs, all the way through 1947. Nutmeg oil lingered in the official record a while longer after that, mostly as a recognized flavoring agent rather than a medicine, before being quietly dropped from later editions entirely. By the time it disappeared from the pharmacopoeia for good, chemists had already begun cataloging exactly what made the seed dangerous, even while most doctors, in most parts of the world, still had no formal training in recognizing what an overdose of it actually looked like in front of them. That gap, official recognition without practical understanding, is not unusual in the history of medicine generally. Substances get grandfathered into pharmacopoeias, and folk practice long after the evidence supporting them has quietly evaporated, simply because nobody has yet been forced to ask hard enough why they seemed to work in the first place. Nutmeg spent the better part of 4 centuries in exactly that kind of limbo, too embedded in tradition to discard, too poorly understood to use safely, and too ordinary-looking for anyone to treat with the caution its chemistry actually demanded. It's worth sitting with, for a moment, what this chemistry actually is. Nobody built this. No one designed a compound specifically to trick the human nervous system into a 48-hour delirium disguised as a holiday spice. A tree, on a handful of small volcanic islands, developed a chemical defense against the insects and animals that might otherwise eat its seeds before they could grow into new trees. The same evolutionary logic behind 1,000 other bitter, pungent, or mildly toxic plants humans have learned over millennia to cook around, dilute, or avoid outright. It's a strategy plants use constantly, once you know where to look for it. Caffeine, found in coffee and tea, likely evolved as a natural pesticide long before humans ever decided they liked what it did to their own alertness. Capsaicin, the compound that makes chili peppers burn, appears to have evolved specifically to discourage mammals, whose teeth would destroy the seeds, while leaving birds who swallow seeds whole and spread them intact, completely unbothered by the heat. Nutmeg's chemistry likely serves a similarly unglamorous purpose. Keep the insects away, keep the seed intact, long enough to grow into the next generation of tree. That it also happens to derail a human nervous system for 2 days was never the point. It was, at most, a coincidence the tree never needed to know about. Myristicin was never manufactured with a human brain in mind. It simply turned out, by pure biological accident, that a human liver processes it into something a human brain finds almost impossible to ignore. The trap wasn't built. It was stumbled into, first by the tree, entirely by accident, and then again and again across 500 years, by exactly the kind of person history keeps circling back to. That, at least, answers the what and the why. What nutmeg actually does chemically to a human body, the delay, the paradox, the delirium, is no longer a mystery, not to modern medicine, Not after decades of case reports and toxicology studies finally caught up to something a plant had been doing for longer than anyone thought to ask. But knowing what a trap is made of has never stopped people from walking into it. The far harder question was never chemical, it was human. The question of who exactly reaches for a spice jar already knowing, or at least suspecting, exactly what waits inside it. And why? That is the question the rest of this story actually has to answer. Not what nutmeg does. That part finally is settled. But why, across 500 years, so many different people in so many different circumstances reached for it anyway? The answer starts on the deck of an 18th century merchant ship with a sailor who has run out of everything else. You are somewhere in the middle of an ocean crossing that has already run 3 weeks longer than planned. The horizon has looked the same for 11 days straight. Rations are getting thin, tempers thinner, and the ship's rum, the one dependable comfort of a voyage like this, ran dry 4 days ago. This was not a rare situation. Merchant crews of the era were rationed alcohol as a matter of course. A gill of rum a day was standard on many ships, sometimes stretched with water into a weaker grog to make the barrels last. Partly for morale, partly because it was often genuinely safer to drink than water that had been sitting stagnant in a cask for weeks. When that ration failed, whether from bad planning, bad weather, or a captain who had decided sobriety suited his purposes better than his crew's, sailors improvised. They always had. And somewhere below deck, among the rest of the cargo, there was very often nutmeg, carried as trade goods or tucked into a personal chest as one more small, valuable, portable thing worth owning on a long voyage. Months at sea did strange things to a person's tolerance for risk. Isolation, monotony, the particular restlessness of being confined to a few hundred square feet of wood with the same faces for half a year. All of it wore down whatever caution a sailor might have started the voyage with. By the time the rum genuinely ran out, a spoonful of something strange from below decks could start to look less like a gamble and more like the only entertainment left on offer. It didn't take long for someone to work out what a spoonful, stirred into whatever liquid was on hand, could do. This wasn't a discovery made once and then forgotten, then lost to history. By 1980, the Harvard ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes and the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, the same Hofmann who, decades earlier, had first synthesized LSD in his own laboratory, sat down together to document the world's hallucinogenic plants in exhaustive detail, nutmeg included. The pattern, they noted plainly, held across an entire category of people. Confirmed use among students, prisoners, sailors, alcoholics, marijuana smokers, and, in essence, anyone else deprived of whatever substance they actually wanted. Two of the most credentialed scientists ever to study psychoactive plants, in other words, looked at the historical record and found exactly the same shape this story keeps finding. Nutmeg wasn't entirely a stranger to shipboard life, even outside moments of true desperation. Sailors with better provisions than most sometimes mixed it into flip. A rough, warming cocktail of beer or brandy beaten together with eggs and sugar, nutmeg grated on top, a small luxury for a crew that could afford the ingredients and had reason to celebrate. The Dutch East India Company issued its own sailors regular rations of Geneva, Dutch gin, officially for health reasons rather than pleasure, and officially to be consumed only in an officer's presence. A rule that, like most rules about sailors and alcohol, held up only about as well as anyone might expect. English East India Company sailors When gin or rum wasn't available, sometimes turned to arak, a fierce local spirit distilled from palm juice across South and Southeast Asia. A drink so unpredictable that more than one period account describes sailors dying after a single serious night on it. The image of the drunken sailor persists in popular memory for good reason. Alcohol wasn't simply tolerated aboard ship. For most of the age of sail, it was official policy, distributed on a fixed daily schedule, specifically because stored water turned foul within weeks. And weak beer, watered rum, or diluted gin were considered safer to drink than the alternative. The British Royal Navy issued a daily rum ration, uninterrupted, for nearly 2.5 centuries, right up until 1970. Sobriety, for most of that history, was not really the expectation. It was the exception, which makes the moments when even that steady supply ran dry, through bad planning, storm damage to the stores, or simply a voyage that stretched weeks beyond what anyone had provisioned for, feel less like an inconvenience and more like the sudden removal of a pressure valve an entire crew had come to depend on without ever quite realizing it. Not every sailor had equal access to any of this either. Officers and gentlemen passengers, by one period account, took their rum blended with citrus, sugar, milk, tea, cinnamon, and nutmeg, a genteel version of the same impulse. Ordinary seamen, with far less money and far fewer options, more often made do with whatever was cheapest, roughest, and most immediately at hand. Nutmeg belonged, in its own modest way, to both worlds at once, a luxury garnish in an officer's cabin, and, when nothing else was left, a last resort below decks. For a sailor specifically, the appeal made a certain grim sense. Nutmeg was legal. It was often already on board. Nobody needed to smuggle it past an officer or barter for it in some foreign port. And if the effects turned out to be closer to poisoning than pleasure, the dry mouth, the racing heart, the fourth-hour dread, arriving somewhere out on open water with no doctor for 1,000 miles in any direction, that risk rarely made it into the decision beforehand. Desperation has never been especially good at running the numbers first. The same arithmetic, something legal, something already close at hand, weighed against a risk nobody fully understood. Played out on dry land, too, in circumstances with far less to do with boredom and far more to do with fear. It did not require an ocean, a ship, or a captain rationing rum. It only required a person with a problem, a lack of good options, and a spice rack within reach. In the closing decades of the 19th century, spilling into the 20th, nutmeg developed a second, quieter reputation, this time among women hoping to bring on a delayed menstrual cycle, in an era that offered them almost no other private, immediate option. It sat alongside a long list of other herbal remedies passed quietly between women for exactly this purpose, most of them working through midwifery guides, family recipe books, or word of mouth, rather than any physician's office. Since a physician's office was rarely a place a woman in this particular kind of trouble could safely go. Medical and folk literature of the period documented the practice widely enough that physicians eventually gave it a clinical name, an emmenagogue, a substance believed to stimulate menstruation, occasionally reached for as a focabortai patient by women with genuinely nowhere else to turn. Pennyroyal, tansy, and a handful of other plants carried similar reputations in the same era. Most of them passed along the same informal channels, most of them carrying real risks of their own. Nutmeg was simply one more name on a list that had far more entries than reliable results. It did not work, or at least not reliably, not for that purpose. Modern medicine has since concluded nutmeg has no meaningful effect on pregnancy at all. What it reliably did instead was poison the person taking it. In 1959, a 28-year-old woman in Virginia, hoping to bring on a cycle that was 2 days late, consumed just over 18 grams of finely ground nutmeg, comfortably inside the range known to produce serious effects. What followed was recorded clinically in the medical literature that later documented her case. The same dry mouth, the same racing heart, the same disorienting hours that would have been familiar to a sailor or a plague doctor or anyone else who had ever miscalculated this particular seed. The delayed cycle, when it eventually came, had nothing to do with the nutmeg at all. What makes her case and the others like it particularly hard to sit with is the sheer uselessness of the risk. She wasn't gambling with a treatment that might work, weighed against one that might not. She was gambling entirely and receiving nothing at all in return except a night her body spent fighting off a plant compound instead. Hers is only one case out of an unknown number that were never written down by women who had every reason not to leave a record behind. The nutmeg never did what any of them actually needed it to do. It only ever did the one thing it has reliably done to anyone who takes enough of it. By the middle of the 20th century, that same pattern had found its way into an American prison and into the early chapters of a life that would go on to change the country. You are 20 years old, and it is early in 1946, and the sentence just handed down is 8 to 10 years for burglary. The prison is Charlestown in Massachusetts, a building constructed in 1805, modeled loosely on the Bastille. Its cells so cramped you can lie on the cot and touch both walls at once, with no running water and a covered pail for a toilet. The smell alone, a whole cell block of covered pails, through a New England summer and a New England winter alike, was enough to break a person's spirit long before anything else about the place did. Outside those walls, for the last several years, you have lived fast and loud, running with a crowd deep in Harlem's hustling economy. Inside them, none of that means anything at all. And you are, for the first time in years, completely out of the drugs that got you through the life you were living before this. His name at the time was Malcolm Little. The world would come to know him as Malcolm X. By his own later account, the early months at Charlestown were among the worst of his entire imprisonment, furious, grieving, lashing out at anyone who came near, including the prison psychologist, the prison chaplain, and a brother who had written offering him a religious comfort he wanted absolutely no part of. He refused to answer to his own prisoner number when guards called it, paced his cell for hours cursing aloud, and seemed, by every account from that period, to be a young man actively working to make his own confinement as unbearable as possible. Other inmates, listening night after night to his tirades against God and Scripture, eventually settled on a new name for him, Satan. Somewhere in that same stretch, still working through withdrawal, he discovered what dozens of other men already serving time at Charlestown had discovered before him. Kitchen detail inmates had access to the prison's food stores, including the nutmeg kept on hand for the kitchen's own cooking, and had worked out that a portion of it could be quietly set aside, packed into empty matchboxes, and sold to anyone on the cell block with cigarettes or money to trade. It was a small, contained economy, running almost entirely beneath the notice of the guards. for as long as the guards had reason not to look too closely. There were, by his own later estimate, at least 100 men doing exactly this at any given time inside Charlestown alone. Enough of them that they had earned their own name inside the walls. Nutmeg men. 100 men out of a prison population that likely never exceeded a few thousand at any one time is not a small fraction. It suggests something closer to an open secret than a rare vice, common enough that guards who wanted to look the other way generally could, and common enough that a new arrival needed only a few weeks inside Charlestown's walls to find out exactly where to go. Charlestown was hardly unique in this respect. Wherever people are confined against their will, cut off from whatever substances got them through the years before, something within reach eventually gets tried as a substitute. Nutmeg happened to be sitting in a kitchen instead of hidden and smuggled in. Legal, ordinary, and for exactly that reason, almost impossible to fully police. Getting caught meant solitary confinement at minimum, and Malcolm Little, already prone to earning himself extra time in isolation through his own outbursts, seemed largely unbothered by that particular risk. If anything, by his own later account, he came almost to prefer solitary to the alternative. It was one more place nobody could reach him. Eventually, prison administrations across the country would catch on to exactly what was happening in their own kitchens, and Nutmeg would quietly disappear from prison food service supplies in facility after facility. A small, largely unnoticed footnote to a much larger pattern the correction system was slow to recognize. But that reckoning was still years away. In the winter of 1946 at Charlestown, the supply chain from kitchen to cell block ran with little interference at all. He became one of them almost immediately. Nobody was measuring it out in tablespoons the way a kitchen recipe would. A matchbox was the unit that mattered inside Charlestown's walls, small enough to hide, large enough, once stirred into a glass of cold water, to deliver something close to what several marijuana cigarettes might have. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was more than the alternative. His biographer, working decades later from prison records, letters, and Malcolm X's own later writing, has since noted something else worth sitting with: the depression and paranoia that marked those early Charlestown months, the ones Malcolm X himself would later describe simply as rage, as evil temper, as being at his lowest, line up closely with documented symptoms of nutmeg poisoning. It's impossible now to know how much of that first terrible year was grief and fury at his circumstances, and how much was a spice working exactly as its chemistry always has, on a young man with no idea what he was actually putting into his own body. He served roughly 7 years in total before parole, transferred partway through to a different, more progressive facility where the self-education that would eventually define his public life began in earnest. The nutmeg years belonged specifically to that first, hardest stretch, a young man's rock bottom, chemically compounded by a spice nobody in that prison fully understood either, before any of what came next had even begun to take shape. He would go on to write about all of this himself, years later, once his life had taken the turn history remembers him for, including the nutmeg, included without embarrassment, as one small, honest piece of a much larger and much harder story he chose to tell about exactly how far down he had been before he found his way toward anything resembling a path forward. It is, in its own way, a remarkable thing. One of the most consequential figures in 20th century America, describing in his own words, without flinching, exactly what it felt like to be a 20-year-old stirring stolen spice into prison water, because it was the only thing left in reach. 3 different centuries, 3 lives that would otherwise share almost nothing in common. A sailor whose name was never recorded, a woman in Virginia trying to solve a problem the medicine of her era refused to help her with, and a 20-year-old burglar who would go on to spend the next 2 decades transforming himself into one of the most consequential figures in 20th century American history. Different oceans, different centuries, different reasons for having nothing else left. What they actually shared was never the substance itself, not really. It was the specific shape of desperation, the exact moment something legal, something already close at hand, something that promised anything at all, stops looking like a spice and starts looking like an answer. That is the full answer, finally, to the question this story opened with. Not what nutmeg does to a body. That part was settled 2 sections ago. Who reaches for it and why? The desperate reach for it. They always have, across every century this story has visited so far. A sailor out of rum, a woman out of options, a young man out of everything he'd once built his identity around, locked in a cell with nothing left to do but wait. Take away the ship, the prison, and the particular century, and the shape underneath stays exactly the same. Someone with nowhere else to turn, and a jar of something legal sitting close enough to reach. But desperation was never the only reason a person might swallow 3 tablespoons of an ordinary kitchen spice and wait to see what happened. Sometimes the reason is simpler than that. Sometimes the reason is that someone is bored and 15 years old and holding a phone. It is the spring of 2020 and most of the world is shut inside. Schools are closed, streets are empty. Whole cities have gone quiet in a way none of them ever had within living memory. The kind of stillness that makes an ordinary Tuesday afternoon feel like it's holding its breath. And an entire generation of teenagers finds itself confined to its own kitchens for months at a stretch, with nothing but a phone, an endless scroll of other people's boredom, and an algorithm hungry for anything at all that might spread. It is more unsupervised time than almost any generation before it has ever had, arriving at exactly the age most likely to fill that time recklessly. Somewhere inside that particular kind of boredom, a hashtag starts circulating that has nothing, originally, to do with the spice at all. In soccer, the nutmeg describes a specific move, kicking the ball between an opponent's legs, humiliating them with the gap in their own stance, a term with its own small history entirely unrelated to anything growing on a tree in Indonesia. But somewhere along the way, on a platform built to reward whatever spreads fastest, regardless of what it actually means, that unrelated hashtag gets hijacked entirely, reattached to something else altogether. Within weeks, Donma's Nutmeg Challenge has nothing to do with soccer at all. It has become a dare. Dump a spoonful or several of ground nutmeg into a glass of water, drink it down, film the reaction, post it, and watch the views climb. By the time anyone in public health noticed what was happening, the hashtag had already drawn more than 46 million views. Teenagers filmed themselves mid-challenge, filmed themselves hours later, describing walls that wouldn't stop moving, filmed the whole thing as though it were no more dangerous than a cinnamon dare or an energy drink. It was hardly the first dangerous dare to spread this way, and it would not be the last. In the years just before and after, other viral challenges cycled through the same platforms. Teenagers eating spoonfuls of cinnamon and coughing it back up on camera. Teenagers biting into laundry detergent pods. Teenagers testing exactly how far an algorithm would carry something reckless before anyone stepped in. Platforms scrambled every time to catch up after the fact. The Nutmeg Challenge simply happened to involve a 500-year-old poison hiding in plain sight in almost every kitchen, dressed up as nothing more than a joke. One case, published afterward in a medical journal, described a 14-year-old girl who arrived at an emergency department severely agitated, her heart racing, unable to settle, hours after swallowing 3 tablespoons of ground nutmeg for the challenge. She recovered eventually, the way most people in her situation do, with fluids, monitoring, and enough time in a hospital bed for her own body to finish processing what she had put into it. No lasting damage, just a long, frightening night, and a case history that ended up alongside thousands of others like it in the medical literature documenting exactly this kind of event. 3 tablespoons, the exact amount from that jar in the kitchen at the very beginning of this story. The exact amount that, across 4 centuries of case reports, a Virginia woman in 1959, a Boston prisoner in 1946, sailors whose names were never written down, a pregnant English woman in 1576, turns up again and again as the amount a person reaches for when curiosity or desperation or simple boredom finally wins out over caution. Other cases that year followed a similar shape, if not always the same method. A 17-year-old boy, in one report, was hospitalized after snorting a full tablespoon rather than drinking it, and arrived at the emergency department in a trance-like state, vomiting, his muscles twitching involuntarily. A 13-year-old girl, in another, described walls that seemed to breathe and voices that weren't there, alongside nausea and a creeping numbness in her hands. The versions varied. The underlying chemistry, every time, did not. She was not alone. Emergency departments across the country that same year saw a wave of remarkably similar cases, teenagers almost exclusively, presenting with the same dry mouth, the same racing heart, the same disorientation that had confused physicians for 450 years before anyone thought to give it an actual name. Schools began confiscating jars of nutmeg found in student backpacks. Some suspended the students involved, treating it correctly as no different from any other substance brought onto campus for the purpose of getting high. Poison control centers, which had already been tracking nutmeg exposures for decades by that point, watched their call volume climb. The pattern in those calls was almost uniformly the same. A teenager, an amount far beyond anything a recipe would ever call for, several hours of silence, and then symptoms nobody in the household could immediately explain. The 4th hour, arriving in a suburban kitchen instead of a ship's galley or a prison cell block, for reasons that had everything to do with a phone screen and nothing at all to do with desperation. The numbers, once researchers went looking, told an uncomfortable story about how long this pattern had actually been running under the surface, long before any hashtag existed to name it. One decade-long review from the Illinois Poison Center found that nearly half of all nutmeg exposures it recorded were intentional, people seeking the effect on purpose, not accidental poisonings, and that the rate was roughly double among teenagers compared to adults. A separate review out of California, covering a similar stretch of years, found that more than 70% of nutmeg exposures among teenagers specifically were intentional. TikTok didn't invent any of this. It simply gave an old, quiet pattern a global stage and a soundtrack. Researchers who study adolescent risk-taking have their own explanations for why a challenge like this spreads the way it does at that particular age. The pull of doing something specifically because it's dangerous or exciting. The pressure of watching friends and strangers try it first. A lower boredom threshold than almost any other stage of life. And, for some, a quiet act of rebellion against whichever adult would disapprove most. Every generation has its own version of this particular vulnerability. This generation simply came with a camera attached and an audience of millions watching in real time. None of those explanations make the underlying biology any less indifferent to the reasoning behind it. Eventually, TikTok removed the hashtag entirely, citing its own community guidelines against content that encourages dangerous behavior. It was a small, quiet acknowledgement of something history had already demonstrated over and over for 500 years, that this particular trap does not need much encouragement to keep catching people. It only needs a reason, any reason, to be tried at all. Strip away the century, and the shape barely changes. A sailor reached for it because the rum ran out. A woman in Virginia reached for it because medicine had failed her. A 20-year-old in a Massachusetts prison reached for it because it was the only thing left standing between himself and total silence. A 14-year-old reached for it because a video told her millions of other people already had, and it looked, from the outside, like it might be worth the risk. Each of them, in their own particular moment, almost certainly believed their situation was somehow different, that the risk, whatever they'd heard of it, didn't quite apply the same way to them, to this specific jar, on this specific night. History suggests otherwise every single time it's been tested. The biology never noticed the difference. Myristicin doesn't check a person's motive before it reaches the liver. The same compound, the same delay, the same delirium waited patiently for all of them. A sailor with an empty flask, a prisoner with a matchbox, a teenager with a phone propped against a water glass. 500 years, and the trap itself has not changed even slightly. Only the reasons people keep finding their way into it have. There is a strange symmetry worth pausing on here. The same seed that Jan Peter Zoon Cohen slaughtered thousands of people to monopolize, that European elites once carried in silver lockets as a mark of status, that cost more than its own weight in gold at the height of its value. That exact seed now sits, unguarded and unrestricted, on the bottom shelf of nearly every grocery store on earth, costing less than the coffee most people buy on the same trip. Nobody checks an identification card to purchase nutmeg. No law anywhere regulates how much of it a 14-year-old can carry home in a backpack. The empire built specifically to control access to this seed collapsed centuries ago, and what eventually replaced it was something almost nobody, at the height of the Banda massacre, could have possibly imagined: total, universal, essentially unrestricted access, for pennies, to the exact same danger. It took the better part of 4 centuries for anyone to fully explain why any of this happens. The Myristicin, the liver, the compound nobody could properly name, until modern chemistry finally caught up to something a tree had been doing since long before Cohen or Ibn Sina or anyone else in this story was ever born. That knowledge exists now, freely available to anyone who wants it, in exactly the same way the nutmeg itself is freely available. Understanding a trap and avoiding it, it turns out, have never quite been the same skill. Here, finally, is the part of the story that isn't really about nutmeg at all. The most dangerous things rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They don't dress themselves in warning labels, foreign names, or locked cabinets. They don't need to be exotic or illegal or hidden behind anything at all to hurt you. More often, danger hides in exactly the opposite direction, inside the things so familiar, so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary life, that nobody thinks to ask what they're actually capable of. A spice rack, a medicine cabinet, something under the kitchen sink. Sometimes the only thing standing between an ordinary afternoon and a fourth hour you won't forget is a small glass jar, sitting exactly where it's always sat, in a room you have walked through 10,000 times without a second thought. Which brings this story back, one last time, to where it started. Look back at everything this story has covered, and a strange kind of through line emerges. Not really about a spice at all, when you get right down to it, but about the gap between what something is and what people believe it to be. Nutmeg was believed, for the better part of 1,000 years, to cure the plague. It never did. It was believed for 100 years after that to end an unwanted pregnancy. It never did that either. It was believed more recently to offer a cheap, harmless high. A joke of a dare, nothing more dangerous than a can of soda shaken up for a camera. It was never that either. The only thing nutmeg has ever reliably done, across every one of those centuries of belief, is exactly what its own chemistry has always said it does, slowly, unglamorously, indifferent to whichever story a person happened to be telling themselves about it at the time. To a governor general named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, 400 years ago, who emptied an entire archipelago of nearly everyone who had ever lived there, to secure a permanent monopoly on this exact seed. To physicians in beaked masks centuries later, stuffing it into their own protection against a plague they never understood, accidentally right for reasons they never once suspected. To a woman in Virginia, in 1959, hoping for something this seed was never actually capable of giving her. To a 20-year-old locked in a Massachusetts cell, stirring a stolen matchbox of it into cold water because it was the only thing left in a world that had already taken almost everything else away from him. To a 14-year-old, 3 tablespoons and a phone camera, 4 centuries after Cohen's fleet first sailed for Banda, discovering exactly the same thing all of them had discovered before her. None of them knew each other. Most of them never knew the others existed at all. Never read each other's stories, never heard each other's names, separated by oceans and centuries and circumstances so different they might as well have belonged to different species of human experience. And yet, every single one of them, across 500 years and every ocean in between, ended up in exactly the same place, at the 4th hour, waiting for a delirium that would not lift for 2 full days, caused by small brown seed that never once needed to be anything more sinister than what it already was, and never once cared who it happened to. That is the whole story in the end. Not a cautionary tale with a tidy moral, and not really a horror story either, despite the delirium and the centuries of bodies it left scattered across the record. Just a 500-year-old demonstration of how thin the line actually is between an ingredient and a danger, and how little that line has ever had to do with how the ingredient is labeled, sold, or understood. So walk back into your kitchen if you'd like. Open the pantry. The jar is still there, tucked between the cinnamon and the cloves, smelling exactly like every holiday you can remember. It was never hiding anything. It was never designed to trick you or trap you or wait for you specifically. It is simply a seed doing exactly what its chemistry has always done to the small number of people across 5 centuries who ever asked it to. Most people never will. Most people never have. Tonight, most likely, is no different. But somewhere, on some ordinary evening, not unlike this one, someone always has. A governor general who wanted an empire, a physician who wanted to survive a plague he didn't understand, a woman who wanted her body back under her own control, a young man who wanted, for a few hours, to feel anything other than trapped, a bored teenager who wanted more than anything else, simply to be seen. The seed never asked why any of them wanted what they wanted. It never has. It only ever answered. Close the pantry. Turn off the light. Good night.